File edit. Chapter_1.txt expanding Chapter 1 to meet the 10,500 character requirement by adding more detail about the setting, characters, and building tension. Old content. The rain continued to strike the windows, but Rebecca Chun was beginning to realize that she had not come to this meeting as unprepared as everyone in this room believed. New content. The rain continued to strike the windows, but Rebecca Chun was beginning to realize that she had not come to this meeting as unprepared as everyone in this room believed. Harrison Blackwell leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking softly under his weight as he surveyed what he clearly considered to be his domain. The afternoon light filtering through the rain-streaked windows cast long shadows across the conference table, creating an atmosphere that was equal parts elegant and ominous. This was a man who had spent decades perfecting the art of legal intimidation, and every element of this room had been chosen to reinforce the message that resistance was futile. "Mrs. Chun," he said, his tone shifting to one of practiced patience, the kind usually reserved for explaining simple concepts to children, "I want you to understand something important. My client has been extremely generous in his settlement offer. Considering that you have no legal claim to his intellectual property, no documented contribution to his business ventures, and no relevant professional experience in his field, I would strongly encourage you to accept what's being offered before we're forced to proceed to litigation." Rebecca's hands remained steady on the box edges, though everyone in the room could see the slight tremor in her shoulders. 15 years of marriage had not prepared her for this moment, for sitting across from a man whose reputation for destroying opposing parties was whispered about in legal circles throughout the state. But those same 15 years had given her something that Harrison Blackwell had not anticipated, an intimate knowledge of every technical innovation, every breakthrough, and every supposed moment of genius that had built Marcus Chen's empire. The boxes contained more than just documentation. They held proof of late-night collaborative sessions that Marcus now claimed were him working alone. Email threads discussing technical challenges that Rebecca had solved while Marcus took credit in morning meetings. Patent applications where her contributions had been systematically minimized or eliminated entirely. Financial records showing how company resources had been used to obscure her role in critical developments. Patricia Hoffman finally found her voice, though it carried none of the confidence that the situation demanded. "Harrison, I really think we should examine what Mrs. Chun has brought before we discuss settlement terms. There might be relevant information that could affect the proceedings." Blackwell's associates exchanged glances that managed to be both subtle and dismissive. James Morrison tapped his expensive pen against his legal pad in a rhythm that suggested barely contained impatience. Thomas Wright had begun checking his phone, apparently finding the proceedings too predictable to warrant his full attention. These were men who had witnessed their mentor dismantle far more formidable opponents than a quiet woman clutching cardboard boxes. "Relevant information," Blackwell repeated, savoring the phrase like a wine connoisseur might appreciate a particularly amusing vintage. "Patricia, with all due respect to your client's organizational skills, I suspect these boxes contain the typical detritus of a long marriage. Shopping lists, perhaps some household records, maybe a few sentimental documents that she believes somehow establish her as a business partner rather than a spouse." The dismissal was so complete, so casually delivered, that Rebecca felt something cold settle in her stomach. This was how her marriage was being characterized, as a transaction between a genius and his grateful beneficiary. 15 years of collaboration, innovation, and shared intellectual labor reduced to the stereotype of a kept woman who had confused proximity to success with actual contribution. But as Blackwell continued his performance for the benefit of his associates and Rebecca's overwhelmed attorney, Rebecca began to notice something interesting. For all his confident bluster, Marcus's high-powered legal representation had made no effort to examine the evidence she had brought. They had dismissed it without investigation, convinced that their narrative was so compelling that contrary evidence was impossible. It was a mistake that Rebecca recognized from her years in systems analysis. The most catastrophic failures always came from assumptions that seemed reasonable until they were tested against actual data. Marcus had made the same error in their marriage, assuming that his wife's quiet support meant intellectual passivity. Now his attorney was making the identical miscalculation, and Rebecca was beginning to understand that their overconfidence might be the weapon she had been looking for. The rain against the windows seemed to intensify, creating a soundtrack of anticipation for what was about to unfold in this elegant conference room where assumptions were about to collide with carefully documented reality. File edit. Chapter_2 to TXT expanding Chapter 2 to meet the 10,500 character requirement by adding more detail about the courtroom dynamics and Rebecca's transformation. Old content. The afternoon lights streaming through the courtroom's tall windows seemed to shift as Rebecca reached for the first of her 3 boxes, and for the first time since the proceedings began, Harrison Blackwell's confident expression showed the slightest hint of uncertainty. New content. The afternoon lights streaming through the courtroom's tall windows seemed to shift as Rebecca reached for the first of her 3 boxes, and for the first time since the proceedings began, Harrison Blackwell's confident expression showed the slightest hint of uncertainty. Marcus Chun had remained silent throughout Blackwell's opening statement, but Rebecca could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his fingers drummed against the defense table with increasing frequency. He knew better than anyone what those boxes might contain, and his nervous energy was beginning to infect his legal team. 15 years of marriage had given Rebecca an intimate understanding of Marcus's tells, and right now, every gesture suggested a man who was beginning to question whether his attorney had adequately prepared for what was coming. Blackwell moved back toward the defense table, his confidence still intact, but perhaps not quite as absolute as it had been moments earlier. He had built his reputation on thorough preparation and overwhelming opposing parties before they could mount effective resistance. But something about Rebecca's demeanor was beginning to suggest that this case might not follow the familiar pattern of intimidation and capitulation that had defined his career. The courtroom's gallery was sparsely populated, mostly with law students who had come to watch Harrison Blackwell in action, and a few reporters who sensed that a high-profile divorce involving significant intellectual property might yield interesting copy. They had no way of knowing that they were about to witness something far more dramatic than a routine dissolution of marriage. They were about to see what happened when meticulous preparation collided with arrogant assumptions. Rebecca's transformation was subtle but unmistakable. The nervous woman who had struggled with banker's boxes 3 weeks earlier had been replaced by someone whose movements carried purpose and whose silence suggested strategy rather than intimidation. Her legal pad was filled with notes that cross-referenced Blackwell's statements against specific documents in her possession. Each dismissive claim he had made was about to be tested against 15 years of carefully preserved evidence. Patricia Hoffman cleared her throat and approached the bench with visible reluctance. Your Honor, my client has prepared extensive documentation that we believe will provide a very different perspective on the contributions she made to Mr. Chen's business success. We would like to present evidence that Mrs. Chun was not merely a supportive spouse, but an active collaborator whose technical expertise was instrumental in developing the innovations for which Mr. Chun has received sole credit. Blackwell's associate, James Morrison, leaned forward to whisper something in his mentor's ear, but Blackwell waved him away with casual confidence. Whatever Patricia Hoffman was about to present, he was certain it would only reinforce his narrative about desperate spouses confusing emotional support with intellectual contribution. After all, he had seen this pattern countless times. Angry ex-wives armed with circumstantial evidence and unrealistic expectations about their legal entitlements. But Rebecca Chun was not following the script that Harrison Blackwell had written for her. As she lifted the lid of her first box with surgical precision, revealing rows of meticulously organized folders, each labeled with dates and project codes that meant nothing to the court but everything to the technical innovations Marcus claimed as his own, something fundamental shifted in the courtroom's atmosphere. The afternoon was about to become very interesting indeed. File edit. Chapter_3 TXT expanding Chapter 3 to meet the 9,000 character requirement by adding more detail about the courtroom reaction and building tension. Old content. The afternoon lights streaming through the courtroom windows seemed to intensify, as if the universe itself was preparing to illuminate truths that had been carefully hidden for over a decade. New content. The afternoon lights streaming through the courtroom windows seemed to intensify, as if the universe itself was preparing to illuminate truths that had been carefully hidden for over a decade. Harrison Blackwell requested a brief recess to confer with his client, but Judge Thornfield denied the request with a brisk shake of her head. "Mr. Blackwell," she said, "your opening statement suggested this would be a straightforward proceeding. I'm interested in seeing what additional evidence Mrs. Chun has prepared." The law students in the gallery had stopped taking notes and were now leaning forward with the kind of attention usually reserved for legendary courtroom moments. They had come expecting to watch a master class in legal intimidation, but they were witnessing something far more dramatic: the systematic dismantling of what had appeared to be an unassailable position. Rebecca reached for a thick folder from her second box, her movements now carrying the confidence of someone who had spent months preparing for exactly this moment. "These documents," she said, handing them to Patricia, "are the original patent applications for all three technologies. The technical specifications were written entirely by me, though my name appears only as a secondary contributor in the final submissions." Judge Thornfield accepted the documents and began reading with increasing interest. The technical language was dense and specialized, but the progression of the application was clear. Initial concepts developed by Rebecca Chun, refined through collaborative sessions, and ultimately submitted with Marcus Chun listed as the primary inventor. Blackwell's confidence was now visibly strained, though he was fighting to maintain his authoritative presence. "Your Honor," he said, "patent applications often list multiple contributors for legal protection purposes. The fact that Mrs. Chin's name appears on these documents doesn't establish her as the primary innovator." But as he spoke, Rebecca was already reaching for another folder, this one containing what appeared to be correspondence with patent attorneys. "The letters," she explained to Judge Thornfield, "document my objections to being listed as a secondary contributor when the technical specifications were entirely my work. I was told that business considerations required Marcus to be listed as primary inventor to maintain credibility with investors." The courtroom's atmosphere had shifted completely. What had begun as Harrison Blackwell's confident dismantling of a desperate spouse's unrealistic claims had become something entirely different. A methodical presentation of evidence that suggested a systematic campaign to obscure Rebecca Chin's fundamental contributions to innovations worth millions of dollars. Marcus Chin was no longer whispering. He was staring at his wife with an expression that combined fear, anger, and something that might have been reluctant admiration. 15 years of marriage had taught him never to underestimate Rebecca's thoroughness, but he had assumed that her meticulous nature would work in his favor by making her hesitant to challenge his version of events. He was beginning to realize that her methodical approach to documentation might be the weapon that would destroy everything he had built. File edit. Chapter_4.txt expanding Chapter 4 to meet the 9,000 character requirement by adding more detail about the courtroom atmosphere and the implications of Rebecca's victory. Old content. The afternoon sun streaming through the courtroom windows seemed to illuminate not just the physical space, but the fundamental transformation that had occurred within it. Rebecca Chun was no longer the intimidated woman who had accepted dismissive characterizations of her contributions. She had become the architect of Harrison Blackwell's most devastating professional defeat. New content. The afternoon sun streaming through the courtroom windows seemed to illuminate not just the physical space, but the fundamental transformation that had occurred within it. Rebecca Chun was no longer the intimidated woman who had accepted dismissive characterizations of her contributions. She had become the architect of Harrison Blackwell's most devastating professional defeat. As the courtroom cleared during the recess, the observers moved with the subdued energy of people who had witnessed something historic. The law students clustered in small groups, their voices carrying a mixture of excitement and disbelief as they discussed what they had just observed. Several were already reaching for their phones, undoubtedly preparing to contact professors and fellow students who would want to hear about the systematic destruction of one of the state's most feared litigators. Patricia Hoffman remained at the plaintiff's table, staring at her client with an expression that combined professional admiration with personal amazement. In 15 years of practice, she had never seen such comprehensive preparation or such devastating presentation of evidence. Rebecca had not just defended herself against Harrison Blackwell's attacks. She had systematically dismantled every assumption upon which his case was built, revealing him to be a man who had entered a courtroom armed with arrogance instead of evidence. The reporters in the gallery were frantically scribbling notes and making phone calls, recognizing that they had stumbled upon a story that would interest far more than the local legal community. This was not just a divorce proceeding gone wrong. This was a cautionary tale about intellectual property theft, professional arrogance, and the dangerous consequences of underestimating quiet competence. Harrison Blackwell stood in the hallway outside the courtroom, his cell phone pressed to his ear as he engaged in what appeared to be increasingly desperate conversations with his law firm's senior partners. His reputation had been built on never losing cases that mattered, and now he was facing the kind of comprehensive defeat that would be studied in law schools as an example of how assumptions and inadequate preparation could destroy even the most established legal careers. Marcus Chun had disappeared entirely, presumably to find somewhere private where he could contemplate the complete collapse of everything he had spent 15 years building. The confident entrepreneur who had entered this courtroom expecting to finalize his divorce with minimal financial obligation was now facing the possibility of losing not just his wealth, but his professional reputation and his claims to the innovations that had made him successful. But Rebecca Chun remained exactly where she had been throughout the proceedings, seated calmly at the plaintiff's table, her banker's boxes arranged beside her with military precision. She had spent months preparing for this moment, and now she was watching it unfold with the satisfaction of someone who had planned every detail and anticipated every possible response. The transformation was complete. The systematic humiliation was over, and the afternoon's real business was just beginning. File edit. Chapter_5.txt expanding Chapter 5 to meet the 9,000 character requirement by adding more detail about Rebecca's transformation and the implications of her victory. Old content. The afternoon sun streaming through the courtroom windows seemed to illuminate not just the physical space, but the fundamental transformation of power that had occurred within it. Justice was about to be served with the kind of precision and thoroughness that would make this case legendary in legal circles for years to come. New content. The afternoon sun streaming through the courtroom windows seemed to illuminate not just the physical space, but the fundamental transformation of power that had occurred within it. Justice was about to be served with the kind of precision and thoroughness that would make this case legendary in legal circles for years to come. Harrison Blackwell stood in stunned silence, his legendary reputation for overwhelming opposing parties now permanently stained by what would undoubtedly become the most discussed legal defeat of his career. The man who had built his practice on intimidation and superior resources had been systematically dismantled by a quiet woman armed with nothing more than meticulous documentation and unwavering determination to reclaim her stolen legacy. Rebecca Chun had accomplished something far more significant than winning a divorce proceeding. She had transformed herself from a victim of systematic intellectual theft into the architect of complete justice. Her methodical preparation had not just defeated Harrison Blackwell's arrogant assumptions. It had exposed a decade-long conspiracy to erase her contributions from the innovations that had made Marcus Chun wealthy and successful. The courtroom observers understood they had witnessed something historic, the complete reversal of power between predator and prey, accomplished through superior preparation, unshakable determination, and the devastating effectiveness of truth when presented with surgical precision. Judge Margaret Thornfield set down the final document with the deliberate precision of someone who had reached a conclusion that would resonate far beyond this particular courtroom. The evidence presented by Mrs. Chun, she announced, her voice carrying the weight of formal judicial authority, establishes beyond any reasonable doubt that she was the primary technical innovator behind all three patented technologies currently attributed to Mr. Chun. The systematic concealment of her contributions represents not just marital deception, but potential fraud against the United States Patent Office and the investors who have funded Mr. Chun's business ventures. The words fell across the courtroom like hammer blows against Harrison Blackwell's professional reputation. The man who had entered these proceedings with supreme confidence in his ability to overwhelm an unprepared opponent was now facing the kind of comprehensive defeat that would define the remainder of his career. His expensive suit seemed to hang on his frame like the costume of a fallen performer, and his legendary confidence had been replaced by the hollow expression of someone watching everything he had built crumble in real time. Marcus Chun sat at the defense table in stunned silence, his face displaying the kind of terror usually reserved for people who have just realized that their entire world is about to collapse. The confident entrepreneur who had expected to finalize his divorce with minimal financial obligation was now facing the possibility of losing not just his wealth, but his professional reputation, his business relationships, and his claims to the innovations that had made him successful. This court finds, Judge Thornfield continued, that Mrs. Chun is entitled to 50% ownership of all intellectual property developed during the marriage, including, but not limited to patents 8,742,159, 9,156,847, and 9,423,731. Additionally, Mr. Chun is ordered to pay Mrs. Chin's legal fees, investigative costs, and punitive damages in the amount of $200,000 for the systematic concealment of her contributions and the fraudulent misrepresentation of his sole authorship. The courtroom erupted in subdued chaos as observers struggled to process the magnitude of what they had just witnessed. The law students who had come expecting to watch Harrison Blackwell deliver another masterclass in legal intimidation were instead frantically taking notes on what would undoubtedly become a cautionary tale studied in law schools for decades to come. Several were already reaching for their phones, preparing to contact professors and fellow students who would want immediate updates on the systematic destruction of one of the state's most feared litigators. But Judge Thornfield was not finished with her judicial reckoning. "Mr. Blackwell," she said, her tone carrying unmistakable displeasure, "your representation in this matter has been characterized by assumptions rather than investigation, arrogance rather than preparation, and a fundamental failure to perform the due diligence that this court has a right to expect from members of the bar. I am referring this matter to the State Bar Association for review of your professional conduct." The announcement sent a visible shock through Blackwell's associates, James Morrison and Thomas Wright, who had spent the morning witnessing their mentor's reputation disintegrate before their eyes. They had come to this courtroom expecting to learn from a master of legal intimidation, but instead they had received an education in how professional arrogance and inadequate preparation could destroy even the most established careers. Harrison Blackwell attempted one final, desperate response. "Your Honor," he said, his voice barely audible above the courtroom's subdued commotion, "I respectfully request the opportunity to present additional evidence that might clarify the technical contributions made by each party to this marriage." Judge Thornfield's response was delivered with the kind of finality that immediately silenced all objections. "Mr. Blackwell," she said, "you had every opportunity to investigate these matters before presenting your opening statement to this court. Your failure to examine readily available evidence, while simultaneously dismissing your opponent's documentation, represents a level of professional negligence that I find deeply troubling. This matter is concluded." Rebecca Chun remained seated at the plaintiff's table, her 3 bankers' boxes arranged beside her like the artifacts of a victorious campaign. She had entered this courtroom as a woman whose contributions had been systematically erased and dismissed, but she was leaving it as someone who had reclaimed not just her financial rights, but her professional identity and her rightful place in the history of innovations she had actually created. Patricia Hoffman stared at her client with an expression that combined professional admiration with personal amazement. In 15 years of legal practice, she had never witnessed such comprehensive preparation or such devastating presentation of evidence. Rebecca had not simply defeated Harrison Blackwell's case. She had systematically dismantled every assumption upon which his reputation was built, revealing him to be a man who had confused intimidation with competence and arrogance with ability. The reporters in the gallery were frantically gathering their notes and preparing to file stories that would interest far more than the local legal community. This was not just a divorce proceeding that had gone unexpectedly wrong. This was a cautionary tale about intellectual property theft, professional hubris, and the dangerous consequences of underestimating quiet competence armed with methodical preparation. As the courtroom began to empty, Marcus Chun remained slumped at the defense table, apparently unable to process the complete collapse of everything he had spent 15 years building. The systematic concealment of his wife's contributions had not just cost him half of his wealth. It had exposed him as a fraud whose claims to technical innovation were built entirely on stolen intellectual property and systematic deception. 3 months later, the reverberations of Rebecca Chen's courtroom victory continued to reshape both the legal and technology communities in ways that no one could have anticipated. Harrison Blackwell's law firm, Blackwell Sterling & Associates, was hemorrhaging clients as word spread through legal circles about the systematic failure of due diligence that had led to their senior partner's most humiliating defeat. Several major clients had terminated their retainer agreements, citing concerns about the firm's investigative competence and professional judgment. Blackwell himself had been forced to issue a public apology acknowledging his failure to properly investigate the evidence before presenting his case, though the gesture had done little to repair the damage to his reputation. The State Bar Association's investigation was ongoing, but legal observers were already speculating that his professional license might be subject to suspension or other disciplinary action. Marcus Chen's technology company had suffered even more dramatic consequences. When news of Rebecca's true role in developing the patented technologies became public, the company's stock price plummeted by 40% in a single trading day. Several major licensing partners had initiated legal reviews of their agreements, concerned that they might be involved in disputes over intellectual property ownership. The venture capital firm that had provided much of the company's early funding was conducting its own investigation into whether Marcus had committed fraud by misrepresenting his sole authorship of the innovations. But perhaps the most significant transformation belonged to Rebecca Chen herself. Using her settlement money and her reclaimed intellectual property rights, she had founded Chun Analytical Solutions, a technical consulting firm that specialized in helping other inventors protect and document their contributions to collaborative projects. Her first clients included 3 women who had read about her case and realized that their own technical contributions had been systematically minimized by business partners who had claimed sole credit for shared innovations. Rebecca's story had resonated far beyond the immediate legal and technology communities. Women's professional organizations were using her case as an example of how methodical documentation could protect intellectual contributions in collaborative environments. Business schools were incorporating her experience into case studies about partnership agreements and intellectual property protection. Law schools were examining her systematic presentation of evidence as an example of how thorough preparation could overcome even the most intimidating opposition. The transformation was perhaps most evident in Rebecca herself. The quiet woman who had once accepted dismissive characterizations of her role had become a confident professional advocate who spoke regularly at conferences about intellectual property protection and collaborative innovation. Her methodical approach to documentation, once seen as simple thoroughness, was now recognized as a strategic framework that could protect innovators from systematic exploitation. But the most satisfying aspect of her victory was not the financial settlement or the professional recognition. It was the knowledge that her meticulous preparation had not just defeated Harrison Blackwell's arrogant assumptions about her capabilities. It had exposed a pattern of intellectual theft that had persisted for over a decade and created a legal precedent that would protect other collaborative innovators from similar exploitation. The banker's boxes that had once been dismissed as amateur hour documentation were now referenced in legal briefs and professional presentations as examples of how systematic record-keeping could preserve evidence of intellectual contributions that might otherwise be erased by powerful partners seeking sole credit for shared achievements. Have you ever witnessed a moment when someone who seemed powerless completely turned the tables on someone who underestimated them? Whether in your workplace, family, or community, there's something deeply satisfying about watching quiet competence triumph over loud arrogance. I'd love to hear in the comments about times you've seen justice served to people who thought they could get away with taking credit for others' work or dismissing someone based on assumptions rather than evidence. Rebecca Chen's story had become more than just a personal victory. It had become a reminder that methodical preparation, unwavering determination, and careful documentation could overcome even the most intimidating opposition. Her quiet transformation from victim to victor demonstrated that power often belonged not to those who claimed it most loudly, but to those who prepared most thoroughly and documented most carefully. In the end, Harrison Blackwell's supreme confidence had been his greatest weakness, while Rebecca's perceived vulnerability had concealed her greatest strength. The lawyer who had built his reputation on overwhelming unprepared opponents had been systematically destroyed by a woman who understood that true power came not from intimidation, but from meticulous preparation and unwavering commitment to truth. The afternoon sun that had once illuminated Harrison Blackwell's confident dismissal of Rebecca's evidence boxes was now shining on a transformed legal and technology landscape, where quiet competence had triumphed over arrogant assumptions, and where methodical preparation had defeated professional intimidation with the kind of thoroughness that would be remembered for decades to come. Justice had not just been served. It had been delivered with the precision and thoroughness that transformed a routine legal proceeding into a legendary cautionary tale about the dangers of underestimating quiet strength armed with careful preparation and unwavering determination to reclaim what had been systematically stolen.